Central Africa. So we're going to look at the culture, the history of it, and I'll show you just here on the next slide which countries we're specifically going to talk about today. So this is the map here. So we're going to talk about the colored ones here. So Chad, Cameroon, Central African Republic, Guinea, Gabon, Republic of the Congo, and Democratic Republic of the Congo. Okay, so we got all those countries there. All right, here we go. So the people. So Central Africa is mostly rural, but it is dotted with urban areas. So there are some cities in it, but for the most part, it's rural. And there's a lot of rainforest in this part. So agriculture is very difficult because there's a lot of vegetation already that exists. But there's we talked with West Africa. There's a lot of different ethnic groups. So, for example, the Mbuti people, they live in the forests, and outside forces have had very little influence on them. So this is the Mbuti people here. As you can see, they're very, very short. So their average height is 4'6". Because they all intermarry, they're all just one kind of clan, and they are hunters and gatherers. But many people call them pygmies because of their short stature. Other groups in Central Africa, we have the Fulani, the Bantu, and the Fang, and so those are the bigger ethnic groups in this area. So history and government. So early settlements, people had lived in Central Africa for more than 10,000 years. So they started to settle in the 600s and 700s in this area, and the Bantu-speaking people around the 800s, they started to establish key African kingdoms. So in particular, the Congo, the Luba, and the Luanda kingdoms. And they also had states in Tanzania, Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. All of those we'll talk about in another set of notes. Okay, so obviously the Bantu people are pretty wide language group. Okay, so slavery. So the Europeans did land in the late 1400s and originally wanted to trade. A lot of this was based on the slave trade. So this region in particular became a center for the slave trade. It was where a lot of the slave traders would raid down into Central Africa to get the slaves to be traded off in West Africa. So the enslaved Africans faced a terrible trip across the Atlantic Ocean known as the Middle Passage, which we talked about before. It's called that because it was the middle part of the triangular trade. So you can see this. So they considered, started in Europe would be the first leg of it, and then this middle part from going from Africa to the Americas would be the Middle Passage, so this journey here. And there's this right here is a picture of how they shipped them in the holes, and they didn't have much room. They mostly had to lay down. They could barely sit up. So there was many layers in each ship that looked like this. It was just packed with people. And so if you were above, it wasn't like it wasn't like you just got to, if you had to go to the bathroom or something, you just got to get up and go to the bathroom. That wasn't how it was. You just kind of went where you were. And if you were below a bunch of people, then you got messy, and it was really gross. And even if you were on above, you were luckier than some, but you were still in a pretty rough situation. So millions of them died on the voyage, and because so many of them went away, because so many of them were stolen, especially the young males, strong young males, that's the ones that they wanted the most. Their societies that they left behind were really set back because they lost a lot of that labor. The intelligence of those people, they could have advanced society in some way, but we'll never know because they never had the opportunity. Okay, so this right here is a short little video about the Atlantic slave trade. Some things that textbooks don't necessarily tell you. It's a TED Talk here.
Slavery, the treatment of human beings as property, deprived of personal rights, has occurred in many forms throughout the world. But one institution stands out for both its global scale and its lasting legacy: the Atlantic slave trade, occurring from the late 15th to the mid-19th century and spanning 3 continents, forcibly brought more than 10 million Africans to the Americas. The impact it would leave affected not only these slaves and their descendants, but the economies and histories of large parts of the world. There had been centuries of contact between Europe and Africa via the Mediterranean, but the Atlantic slave trade began in the late 1400s with Portuguese colonies in West Africa and Spanish settlement of the Americas shortly after. The crops grown in the new colonies, sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, were labor-intensive, and there were not enough settlers or indentured servants to cultivate all the new land. American natives were enslaved, but many died from new diseases, while others effectively resisted. And so, to meet the massive demand for labor, the Europeans looked to Africa. African slavery had existed for centuries in various forms. Some slaves were indentured servants, with a limited term and the chance to buy one's freedom. Others were more like European serfs. In some societies, slaves could be part of a master's family, own land, and even rise to positions of power. But when white captains came offering manufactured goods, weapons, and rum for slaves, African kings and merchants had little reason to hesitate. They viewed the people they sold not as fellow Africans, but criminals, debtors, or prisoners of war from rival tribes. By selling them, kings enriched their own realms and strengthened them against neighboring enemies. African kingdoms prospered from the slave trade, but meeting the Europeans' massive demand created intense competition. Slavery replaced other criminal sentences, and capturing slaves became a motivation for war rather than its result. To defend themselves from slave raids, neighboring kingdoms needed European firearms, which they also bought with slaves. The slave trade had become an arms race, altering societies and economies across the continent. As for the slaves themselves, they faced unimaginable brutality. After being marched to slave forts on the coast, shaved to prevent lice, and branded, they were loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. About 20% of them would never see land again. Most captains of the day were tight packers, cramming as many men as possible below deck. While the lack of sanitation caused many to die of disease, and others were thrown overboard for being sick or as discipline, the captains ensured their profits by cutting off slaves' ears as proof of purchase. Some captives took matters into their own hands. Many inland Africans had never seen whites before, and thought them to be cannibals, constantly taking people away and returning for more. Afraid of being eaten, or just to avoid further suffering, they committed suicide or starved themselves, believing that in death their souls would return home. Those who survived were completely dehumanized, treated as mere cargo. Women and children were kept above deck and abused by the crew, while the men were made to perform dances in order to keep them exercised and curb rebellion. What happened to those Africans who reached the New World, and how the legacy of slavery still affects their descendants today, is fairly well known. But what is not often discussed is the effect that the Atlantic slave trade had on Africa's future. Not only did the continent lose tens of millions of its able-bodied population, but because most of the slaves taken were men, the long-term demographic effect was even greater. When the slave trade was finally outlawed in the Americas and Europe, the African kingdoms whose economies it had come to dominate collapsed, leaving them open to conquest and colonization. And the increased competition and influx of European weapons fueled warfare and instability that continues to this day. The Atlantic slave trade also contributed to the development of racist ideology. Most African slavery had no deeper reason than legal punishment or intertribal warfare, but the Europeans who preached a universal religion, and who had long ago outlawed enslaving fellow Christians, needed justification for a practice so obviously at odds with their ideals of equality. So they claimed that Africans were biologically inferior and destined to be slaves, making great efforts to justify this theory. Thus, slavery in Europe and the Americas acquired a racial basis, making it impossible for slaves and their future descendants to attain equal status in society. In all of these ways, the Atlantic slave trade was an injustice on a massive scale, whose impact has continued long after its abolition.
right, so that is the African or the Atlantic slave trade. So, as you can see, it did have a major impact not only on the Americas but also on Africa as well. Okay, so moving on to European colonization. So it wasn't really until the 1800s that large areas of Central Africa were colonized. One of the biggest reasons for it was malaria. So, like I said before, there's a lot of rainforest in this area, and as a result, a lot of mosquitoes. Therefore, a lot of malaria. What ended up happening was France eventually took over the Republic of the Congo. They promised to protect them from Belgium, who has what is the present day Democratic Republic of the Congo. But they changed their economy to resource extraction and growing cash crops. So we start to see towns spring up along major railways. So that was one actually good thing the Europeans did was they built up the railroads and the infrastructure in Africa to better transport goods and that. And so trade was actually better as a result of the Europeans. But the Europeans also promoted their own culture, which in turn weakened African traditions. So they even replaced their local government with their own. That's known as direct rule. So all the countries except for Britain basically used direct rule. And so that's where, like I said, where they took their people, so like the French would take French people and make them the heads of towns and villages and that. Whereas the British, what they would do is they would leave in the existing government, and then that government would basically answer to the British. Okay, unless there was some major insurrection, then they would go to direct rule. But after World War II, we start to see a lot of resistance, and by 1960, all the French colonies had become independent. And so that's most of Central Africa. So this right here shows the map of that you've seen before of the colonial rule. So you could see the French territories here. You see the Belgian Congo. This is present-day Democratic Republic of the Congo. Okay, you can see the Germans control some area here. You got some by the British. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. All right, so instability after independence. So people in most Central African countries experience periods of ethnic strife, harsh rule, and human rights abuses after independence. After independence, there's a lot of dictatorships that are going to rise all throughout Africa. But the Democratic Republic of the Congo had a really particularly terrible dictator in Mobutu Sese Seko, and he ruled from the 60s to the 90s, and his rule was just filled with human rights abuses, one-party rule, and war. And so natural resources have actually helped some of these countries achieve some kind of stability because they were able to build up their economies. So, for example, oil revenues have helped the Republic of the Congo with their debts and have provided a more stable government as a result. So culture, so the language, about 700 local languages in the Democratic Republic of Congo alone. So just in that one country, there's over 700 languages. French is widely spoken, but Pidgin is also widely spoken, and Pidgin is a really cool language. It's very simplified speech that's used among people who speak different languages. So if you know like one basic language like French or English, you can basically speak Pidgin, okay? Because it is almost not a universal language, but it has the same rules, and so it's very simple, a very simple language to learn. The arts, so the Mingbetu indigenous people are known for their art, and here's some example of this. So they make pottery and sculptures that often have elongated heads. As far as religion goes, there's many traditional African religions in this region. Most of them believe in the existence of a supreme being and a ranked order of deities. So usually there's a god and then the god's sons, and usually in order of when they were born is how high they are ranked. But they also believe in nature spirits, and they honor the ancestors and family members who have died. So we'll talk about, when we get into Asia, we'll talk about this as well. And that the idea is that your ancestors can help influence your life, even, as a spirit. Christianity is also widely practiced, obviously, because of European colonialism, Roman Catholicism in particular in the French controlled areas. So a lot of this is French controlled, so there's a lot of Roman Catholicism in this area. As far as family life is often interwoven with religion. So in many cases, you see multiple generations, even people from different families sometimes live in the same house. All right, education. So historical conflicts have really strained the education system. So education wasn't really necessarily a very high priority immediately after independence, but there has been efforts in more recent years to improve. So literacy rates range from 49% in the Central African Republic to 87% in Equatorial Guinea, but women it's lower, and then also in the more rural areas it's much lower. But healthcare, once again, they don't have great healthcare. The healthcare they do have is usually provided by the WHO, but Central Africa's countries lack safe drinking water, a shortage of vaccines for curable diseases like the flu and things like that, and a rising number of AIDS victims. So we'll get more into the AIDS epidemic as we go, but AIDS is a very big deal in Africa even to this day. All right, and that's all I got for you today. Don't forget to do your processor. Have a good day.